Good morning, everyone. Thank you for summing up the courage to get up so early in the morning and attend our first panel. Our first panelists are not your average Marxist authors, which I think is a good thing, a sign of a good dynamic on the left, basically of the fact that we are now in a position to sum up all these different voices and try to tackle the problems of the ongoing crisis and generally the problems of left organization in a different way, maybe with a accent on different kind of conundrums and problems. And it is also an opportunity for various segments or fractions on the left to enter what I hope to be a productive conversation or a productive argument, of course, based on evidence and on the developed theoretical notions. So I hope that you will find these two introductory presentations interesting. On my far right is Danijela Dolenec from the eco-socialist think tank called Group 22 or Grupa 22 in Croatian. She is also member of the University of Zagreb, but that is not so important as her work in the eco-socialist think tank, which is trying to bring into the public discourse some new problems, especially with regard to the climate policy, which have not been very much discussed in the course of our post-socialist transition. Danijela will talk about the commons as a principle of socialist governmentality. Again, another important topic which kind of goes parallel with different kinds of Marxist discussions about the principles of socialism. So we will hear two presentations that are not in strict sense Marxian, that do not follow a Marxian pattern of argumentation. And I think that is potentially the value of these two contributions, and I hope that the debate afterwards will be fierce and based on arguments and evidence. I will now give the floor to Danijela.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. One way you can see. I want to thank, of course, Mislav for his lovely introduction and say that, one way you can see I'm a misfit is that I'm probably going to be the only person with a PowerPoint at this conference. But that's just instead of an introduction. So as you see, the title of the talk is "The Commons as a Principle of Socialist Governmentality," which, even just looking at the title, you can tell that there's a lot of stuff in there, different types of stuff. What I want to say by way of introduction is that what I want to say today is part of what I see as a larger research project, which I've started actually with Mislav. So what we
that puts me in the conflict of interest.
Yes, exploring the principles of socialist governmentality. But of course, as we do when we write academic papers, we thank everybody who's helped, but all the errors are mine. So in that sense, everything I've done today, of course, is a strand that I've developed for this talk particularly. Some of you I know have read the paper because I've heard comments already, but what we've done in the paper is contrast the work of Branko Horvat with Elinor Ostrom. And again, of course, a lot of people feel uncomfortable just at the thought of doing such a transgression, because one is a Yugoslav Marxist thinker, and the other is an offspring of what we would call a neoclassical tradition. So it's definitely not a comfortable marriage. But in the initial kind of exploration, which was very theoretical, very exploratory in the sense that it looked for interesting avenues of exploration which would contribute to a socialist governmentality, and I will explain that. we kind of charted 3 directions. One is how they conceptualize what would be a social domain outside of both states and markets. The other one is the dialogue about the importance of ownership regimes in contrast to governance regimes and structures. And the third one was we were looking at whether we can find both in Elinor Ostrom and in Branko Horvat ideas and principles which can help us design a politics which will frankly leave behind the ideas of economic growth, which will enable us to pursue material sustainability and degrowth strategies. So that was kind of the initial idea, very ambitious and in a very kind of introductory phase, I have to say. So what I've done today is only push a little bit further this second strand, respective conceptions of ownership and governance. That's the topic that I want to explore today. In the first part of the talk, it will be fairly theoretical in terms of speaking about principles, and then in the second, I will try to be more specific in showing an example of what I think should be a political argumentation which helps develop what I call here socialist governmentality. So again, of course, I expect that a lot of people in the audience are familiar with the concept, and as you know, Foucault developed it by analyzing liberal governmentality. There is an enormous literature on this, and I do not pretend or suppose to have mastered all of it, so I've decided to simply put on the slide a few things, a few pointers which I consider useful when talking about this. So on a very basic level, governmentality as a concept refers to techniques and procedures through which individuals and populations are governed. That's one of the definitions. But why it's actually an interesting concept is because it, as you know, it's a coined term of 2 words, because it tries to put in one concept both the ideational and the practical components. So sometimes this is talked about as knowledge and power. And what that means is that when we talk about governmentality, we at the same time talk about a discursive practice, so putting together concepts, objects, arguments, justifications, ideas, and at the same time thinking about the technology of power, meaning specific forms of intervention, that being institutions, legal forms, and so forth. And you see here why then, when we talk, this is where I see, if we talk about institutions and legal forms, this is where I see the concept of governmentality being useful for the discussion about the commons on the one hand, and the specific dialogue between ownership regimes and governance on the other. So what we draw also from the literature from Foucault is that, according to him, socialism was very good in the first of these 2 components. So the political rationale, the ideas, the concepts, and the arguments, or we can basically, simplify it and say socialism has a clear vision of the society it wants to accomplish, but it lacks the practical capacity to generate institutions that would embody it. Or maybe today we could also say that there have been attempts, the 20th century attempts that we know, which failed for many reasons. And so we still, in that sense, I guess we can say, or at least that's what I think, that the design of institutions which would embody socialist power is the primary task on the left. So we know what we want. I mean, we know that we want a society which will enable freedom for all, emancipation and equality and all that. But what we need is developing technologies of power, meaning developing a directive capacity so that society goes in the direction that we want it to go in. And that's why I think the concept of governmentality is useful. Okay, having established that so that we are kind of all on the same page, I decided to just give you my main point relatively in advance, and then try and develop it with the idea of ownership regimes and governance. So the key point, and half of it I've already said, is the first part of the key point is that the left should engage in the design of institutions. So it should be much more interested in that than it is. And in doing this, it should stop relocating the struggle from the terrain of interests to the terrain of morals. And I mean, of course, I'm not saying that there isn't a moral argument to be made around the fact that as we encountered this argument most frequently, is that not all aspects of our lives should be exposed to the market, or as we, in our local struggles tend to say, I don't know, education is not a commodity, or things like that. Of course, there is an argument to be made of that, but what I think is that we are much more, we have much more power if we do not invoke moral arguments, but rather when we try to show that unless we act together, life is going to get much shittier pretty soon. And here I mean on many different levels and aspects, including material sustainability. One example I have of this is, again, a book I suspect at least some of you have encountered by two British authors, which came out in 2010, which is called Why Greater Equality is Better for Everyone. And this is an example of what I'm trying to say, where the book does not try to put together a convincing moral argument why equality is good, but rather has a very persuasive empirical argument showing that societies which redistribute more, which have a greater level of equality, have also managed to avoid different types of social problems and ills, as we would call them, ranging from child mortality to crime to prison rates to different types of mental illness and so forth. So it's a very convincing argument which shows that societies that have redistributed actually create environments which are better off for everyone, not only the ones at the bottom, as we say. Okay, so that's kind of the main argument, and now it will reappear in this kind of discussion about ownership and governance. So here the starting point, and this is also a part that's from the paper, is due to the emphasis on private property as a crucial capitalist institution. In the writings of the left, there has been a lot of attention on the claim that common ownership rights are the key institutional innovation, which is important for the socialist project. You know this argument, of course, that we should replace private ownership with some sort of public or common ownership, or social ownership, as it was once called. So I have examples of this, for example, in Lindbaugh, who says, the commons are a theory that vests all property in the community. So it's about, transferring property to the community. Also in the 2009 conference in London, Badiou, in a truly emancipated society, all things should be owned in common. Again, focusing on ownership, who owns certain things. And in contrast, what was, I think, probably the kind of the entry point why we thought, the heretic idea of comparing Horvat and Ostrom makes sense, is because they were both centrally concerned with principles of governance. How do we govern a property or a resource of any kind, rather than saying whether it's private property, it's a public property, or a common property. And so, just to kind of bring that a bit more in focus, those of you who know the work of Elinor Ostrom know that if we needed to really boil it down, things that she was doing for decades, is we could say that all her empirical work, looking at a lot of different case studies of communities which were successful in managing resources, natural resources mostly, sustainably. She looked at various, very large number of examples in both developed and developing countries. And the idea of her work was to then distill from many different empirical circumstances governance principles which ensure sustainability and which are fair. And one of the basic principles that she distilled from all this empirical work is those affected by a given rule participate in the making of it. That's kind of a governance principle, which today when we say the commons, at least for me, that's what I mean. Those affected by a given rule participate in the making of it, which, using different vocabulary means democratizing power, creating social power. Similarly or differently, definitely from a very different both theoretical tradition and historical context, Branko Horvat also said normative solutions to the question of ownership are insufficient. Of course, that was one of the main lessons of the Yugoslav experience, that simply transferring ownership did not solve the problem. Why? Because as he said, both I think it's already in the 1969 Ogledi o Jugoslavenskom društvu, class societies don't emerge from types of ownership over means of production, but from class control, who controls what happens in the production. And so Yugoslav experience showed that abolishing private ownership doesn't do away with class society, because, as you know, the new enemy became the bureaucratic class. I wanted to also link this up to Wendy Brown's work, who talks about the same thing but uses a bit of a different vocabulary. And obviously what I'm trying to do in this whole talk is link up different traditions which I think are trying to stress the same message. And what she's saying is, I think, very similar to what I've just said, that the problem of domination in capitalist relations can't be resolved at the level of distribution, which is for me very similar to saying can be resolved at the level of status and rights and ownership, no matter how egalitarian it may be. And here is a quote from her, which I think stresses this really well. So if we analyze capitalism as a political economy of domination, exploitation, or alienation, then the problem of freedom is foregrounded as a problem of social and economic power, and not only a matter of legal and political status. And so I underlined this kind of power versus status. And this is how I also read ownership versus governance. So governance is about power, who controls, to what end, while ownership regimes are about status. Okay, self-management was an attempt of abolishing bureaucratic class control over means production. Let me just see how I'm doing on... All right. I've also stressed here advancing a socialist governmentality then, I think, is in devising democratic governance principles which disable the formation of class control and domination. In contrast to that, this is basically a little bit repetitive from where I started the talk. Much of the progressive political agenda in recent years is not about democratizing power, but with distribution questions. And what happens when we focus on distribution questions is we basically maintain the assumption of a limited government, which is of course a liberal precept, and we're not advancing the concept of popular government, which is always extending the domains of self-government. What I mean by this is that when we politically advocate distribution, redistribution of some sort, we implicitly accept that this is going to be done by an external source, rather than advocating that we should be involved in more and more domains of our lives and how they're governed. Okay, I think I've stressed this enough. And this now leads me to the last part of the talk, which is trying to show a little bit of what I've now been arguing more theoretically, trying to shift this to the political terrain and say a little bit about what I think is wrong or could be improved in terms of how we advocate different policies on the left. So the trap. I've entitled this slide "The Trap." As we know, the commons, so in Croatian we say zajednička dobra, javna I zajednička dobra. This is how we use this. And today we are mostly using this concept in social struggles which are resisting privatization and resisting commodification. And of course this is absolutely justified in the context of austerity politics, where at the same time, both public enterprises and public services are under attack by privatization and commodification processes. But at the same time, the problem here is that in this kind of advocacy, we are protecting the status quo. And I think that's a trap, which makes left politics conservative, because it makes us at least sound and of course very easily construed as focusing on preserving what's here now. That's absolutely, in definition, that's conservative. While neoliberal prescriptions are then of course construed as representing modernization, change, reform, progressiveness, and so forth. And also a lot of the I think argumentation on the left can be construed as naive, because it confronts questions of hard constraints, such as there's no money, with moral arguments, such as education cannot be left to the market. It's a moral principled argument which doesn't even go into a discussion about hard constraints. So I think that aligning techniques of governing with socialist rationale and objectives should start not by moving the discussion to something else, but rather by acknowledging problems and constraints, and then reframing them, reframing how we see where the problems originate, and of course then reframing how we see that solutions to problems can be where can we look for them. And so examples of this, or well, there's two examples, but basically one story. The first one is one of my favorites because I think it's paradigmatic in many ways, and I've encountered this story while I was researching my PhD. So the mayor of Novi Pazar in Serbia, he lost the 2008 election. Doesn't matter to what cause, but what happened afterwards when new administration came into office, he was accused of misappropriating about 18 million euro from the city budget, and of course there's this very famous, or very how would we say, a very common scenario: false public tenders, fictitious public works, favoritism, illegal contracts, you name it, everything, every kind of abuse and misappropriation. But this is not, of course, why I think the story is interesting. The story doesn't end there, because when he finished his mayoral post, he decided that the office that he used to occupy, I think for 8 or 10 years, was also somehow his to take. So he decided to take with him the desk and the chairs and the furniture that was there, and also decided that the air conditioning could be deinstalled. So he deinstalled the air conditioning and took that with himself, and didn't stop at that, but then finally decided to also take the sockets out of the walls. So he literally cleaned out the entire mayoral office, and that's how that's I guess his idea of transferring office to somebody else. So it's perfectly clean and somebody can start over. Of course, I mean, this is a terrible example of a predatory concept of public office, and it's just an example that always makes me laugh as well. The other one I put up here is Croatian Railways, which is more kind of, for us, more of course painful, where and politically now hot and contested, but I think here we can talk about it. You know that the Croatian Railways in recent years have been using private detective agencies in order to be able to detect at least some of the abuse that's been going on in this company, and some of the stuff that they found is the obvious, like stealing petrol, enormous, really substantial amounts of petrol stolen from the company and sold in private markets, also copper pipes and different types of materials, but also, for instance, which is another amusing story, a group of friends running a private business in the restaurant coaches of the trains. So you would think that while riding on the train, you're being serviced by the Croatian Railways, but you were not. You were actually being serviced by a private entrepreneur who was using this space for his own effect. Again, this is simply to give us an example that we know, and I've also, in choosing the examples, I've decided I didn't want to maybe use the one that's closest to us. A lot of people in this room are part of the academic community in Croatia, but I could have, of course, also used the problem or the issue of Academic Solidarity Union and how this organization is handling problems of abuse and corruption within the University of Zagreb. But let me just put it out there, because maybe that will also provoke some people to say something. So why all this? Because the typical, yeah, that's going to be fine. Because the typical left response with the question of corruption and abuse of public office is either this is not a problem, or some kind of an argument, this is construed, this is just leading us to in the wrong direction, or yeah, but workers and little people steal a little, while the big shots, that's the big robbery, and all these kinds of arguments. And what I'm saying is, no, I mean, that's the wrong approach. If we want to talk about trying to develop governmentality in the direction of using techniques of governing and developing directive capacity so that institutions embody what we see as principles, then we should start from, yes, this is a problem, but the way we see both the origins and the solutions is different. And just a very... and of course, another point that I put up there, that immediately, I think addresses both the problem of left politics sounding naive and sounding conservative, because this way it starts from saying the status quo is unacceptable, and we see ways in which it can be changed. And so and this is the end, one before the last slide. The liberal interpretation of examples that I've given you, you all know. It runs by saying that the origin of the problem is publicly run services are always abused because nobody is invested in making them run properly. And that's like the old argument all the way from Yugoslavia. Social property means it's nobody's property. And the solution is transferal to private hands because private owners need to make a profit, so there will be no abuses. That's kind of the argument that we've always heard. What I suggest would be a different type of argumentation, both about the origin and the solution, is, and this links me back to my theoretical part of the argument, the problem is not in the type of ownership. So it's in the approach to governance and the question of democratic control. The parasitic, so then the problem becomes the parasitic behavior of political parties with respect to the state and the public enterprises, utilities and services. And basically what we need to say is, though they are legally public, so ownership is public, but what they are actually is private. They are privatized. They are used as private resources for the maintenance of power of certain groups in society. So you see how we switch from ownership, who owns something, to what is actually happening with it. It's governed as private property. That's the example from Novi Pazar. A different interpretation, I think, immediately implies a different solution. So we start by saying, we can, I think now, and this is, I think, directly relevant, this is why I chose this as a topic for today, this is directly relevant for how we will argue against further privatizations of public utilities and services in Croatia. The neoliberal prescription of deregulate, liberalize, and privatize has been going on long enough that we have many examples to show that privatization will not lead to more efficient use, to cheaper prices, to better quality services. There are numerous examples which attest that this is not the case. And the other part of where I said institutional cynicism is, what I also think we should stress is that contrary to popular belief, capitalist relations and corruption are intimately intertwined. And here I quote from Wolfgang Streeck, who says that capitalism can be understood as a system of social relations that institutionalize cynicism, in the sense that we are all disposed to apply, avoid, or circumvent rules for individual benefit. That's the essence idea of capitalist relations. And in that sense, when you hear an argument that extending market relations will curb corruption, that's a simple myth. Instead, and that's kind of my final point. Proposing a solution which would be embodying something that I see as a socialist governmentality is that we propose running key societal infrastructure and services as commons. So not be content with conceptualizing them as public entities which are in effect under class control, under the control of political parties, but as entities over which we have effective social control, both in how they are run and to what end. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Danijela. So now we have about half an hour for a discussion. 20 minutes? Half an hour. Half an hour. For I was about to say myths and comments about for questions and comments, not myths and comments. So please don't hesitate. Be brave.
Yeah, I had two brilliant presentations. Thanks very much. Just a comment on the last topic. In Sacramento and now also Berlin and Hamburg, we had a lot of struggles around anti-privatization and how to deal with the concept for struggles for re-municipalization, the kind of public, going back to the public. And then immediately, in the short term, there was a debate about going back to public. Well, we know that from before. It isn't better. That was your argument. So the movement thought about how to organize a different form of public services with some kind of councils of elections from the board to the board, and things like that, complete transparency of what the board is doing, things like that. So it has become some kind of societal control about that, at least if we win the fights in Berlin, we will see. But there's another problem of that kind of governmentality, because the people engaged in these kind of struggles and later on in these expertise you need to run a, let's say, complicated energy system, is again with a clear class division, if you like, because it's more or less very much people with academic background, or let's say people with high knowledge who engage in these kind of democratic self-organization, if you like. And again, you have the problem how to reach out to the others. So this is still a gap in the movement, and I think also in the theory.
Well, is there any other questions? Yeah.
For Danijela, I'm probably misconstruing this in a sense. I felt there was a bit of an either-or between the kind of forms of control and questions of distribution and redistribution. Because for me, the fact that redistribution has fallen off the agenda within neoliberalism, but also within the left, is problematic. And to avoid precisely that point, that voice and participation are simply just new liberal mechanisms of class control, redistribution needs to be part of the package, surely, with rights, regulation, voice. But I suspect you probably agree with me, but I wanted to make that question.
Just a small comment to the presentation, and it's really interesting and intriguing in the sense of pragmatic or potential socialist governance. Now, my comment comes from an experience we had in Greece for many years. In the early 1980s, various forms of administrative control and intervention in primary and secondary education were abolished. Teachers had to follow the program, but there was no official mechanism that could intervene and bring them back in line, except for criminal practices and things, or violence and things like that. So for many years, the attempt from the part, especially after the neoliberal turn in Greece, even beginning in the early 1990s, apart from the debate in education, has been how to bring quality assurance within education. And it's interesting that the ideological justification is usually some form of accountability against the public, against students, against society, etc., etc., etc. And I was thinking that when talking about another form of governance, potentially socialist, we must be really careful in the sense that such a form can be easily co-opted by neoliberalism, use our various justifiable demands such as accountability, relations, and we also need to define this new form of governance in ways that are oppositional to just better working with the state. For example, as opposed to quality assurance within education, one should, for example, conceive of a very different relation between the school and society through movements, through assemblies, through different relations with parents, but it has to be somehow incorporate the element of the movement, the element of active society within different forms or alternative forms of democratic governance, which, just play with words, this would make sure that socialist governance does not become technology of power.
Okay, thank you. We'll take some other questions later if they're. Okay, well, Danijela, you can go first.
Okay. Thanks very much for the questions. Especially, I welcome your question because it helped me maybe clarify some of the things that I wanted to say. So you've mentioned Berlin. I know the example of remunicipalization, how do we say it, of water supply, right? Water management in Berlin. Also, there is a recent example in Naples, which is going a bit further. Those of you who know the work of Ugo Mattei, there it's also being transferred back from being privatized, but they're actually trying to build in some principles of the commons. So basically going further from just returning it back into a public utility and trying to be very innovative in how they design. So ownership, of course, important, going back to public hands, but governance principles trying to install more social control within. But the way I understand your question, I will use some of the insight that came from Branko Horvat and the experiment of self-management in Yugoslavia. Today, when you listen to incarnations of left thinking in the West, especially in the United States, and again, I'm sure you know this, there is a lot of hope put into what we call economic democracy. So let's have companies being run by workers, and as if this is kind of the main policy that will bring enormous change. And again, this is one of the experiences where the Yugoslav experiment is very very important, because it shows that on the level of the company, there's only so much you can address, because social hierarchies and class hierarchies reproduced outside of the management of a given company, and this is how I read what you also said. So what you have with many commons movements currently in Western Europe is that they are middle-class endeavors. So yes, you will get involved if the governance mechanism allows for some sort of citizen participation, but who will get involved? Only those who have the time and the resources and the knowledge and the different types of expertise. And on top of that, when we talk about services and utilities which require specialist knowledge, that's another level of course, exclusion which happens. So, and that brings me to stressing what Paul said. Of course, I imply redistribution, of course, because without that, without having policies which will radically transform precisely this, who has the resources to get involved, who has a little bit of spare time to become a citizen, that's the crucial question. Without that, a lot of what we talk about today when we talk about the commons is really nothing more than what I said, like a middle-class entertainment, and that kind of points also to how I read the last question. Invoking governance principles which will create some sort of social power is not a panacea. Case by case, if you look at it, then sometimes it's what you say co-opted for neoliberal purposes. Your example reminded me of another one, which I've those of you who've heard earlier versions of my talk have heard me say this example, but I think it's very illustrative. Is, for example, of the example of childcare. So in Western European countries, for instance, in the Netherlands, you have also what is considered a commons movement in communities, neighborhoods. So, for instance, like in Verbik or Cvjetno naselje, people get together and communalize childcare in the sense that they think this is emancipatory for the children. It's not institutionalized. It's not paternalistic. You can have, you can teach your children to be very tolerant and all these things. But in effect, what this has helped is to divest the state from the responsibility of providing childcare. And again, something that looks as a very interesting emancipatory practice actually has a very detrimental effect to those who cannot afford to be involved in such activities. That's it.
Any more questions? Okay, that's good because we're just out of time. We'll have a brief recess and then we'll gather here at noon, at high noon. Thank you. Yeah, and there's coffee outside.